Learn English through story. Surrender to temptation. In the bustling city of Meridian, where skyscrapers pierced the clouds and neon lights painted the nights in vibrant hues, there lived a man named Adrian Mercer. At 35, Adrian seemed to embody success. His position as a financial strategist in one of the city's most prestigious firms had afforded him a life of luxury. A penthouse overlooking the skyline, a sleek sports car, and a wardrobe tailored to perfection. Yet, beneath the surface of his meticulously curated life lay a void, a gnawing emptiness he couldn't articulate. Adrian was married to Elise, a kind-hearted woman with an unshakable faith in him. She had been his anchor during his meteoric rise, offering unwavering support and love. But as the years went by, the spark that once defined their relationship began to fade. Their conversations grew shorter, their laughter more infrequent. Adrian found himself retreating into his world of numbers and deals, while Elise immersed herself in charity work, trying to fill the silence that had crept into their lives. One evening at a gala hosted by his firm, Adrian met a woman named Celeste. She was unlike anyone he had ever encountered, mysterious, with an air of confidence that drew people to her effortlessly. Her emerald green eyes seemed to see through his polished facade, and her laughter carried a hint of mischief. As they spoke, Adrian felt an unfamiliar excitement stirring within him, a dangerous pull he hadn't felt in years. Their conversations grew more frequent, first through casual encounters at social events, then through late-night texts that turned into phone calls. Adrian justified it to himself as harmless, just a friendship. But deep down, he knew he was playing with fire. Celeste was a temptation, a siren song that promised an escape from the monotony of his life. As weeks turned into months, Adrian's connection with Celeste deepened. She challenged his perspectives, made him question the choices that had led him to his current life. With her, he felt alive, unburdened by the expectations that weighed him down. But with every stolen moment, the guilt gnawed at him. Elise, oblivious to the storm brewing within Adrian, continued to trust him implicitly. One fateful evening, Adrian and Celeste found themselves alone at a secluded bar. The air between them was charged with unspoken desires. As they leaned closer, the world outside faded away. In that moment, Adrian made a choice that would set off a chain of events he could never have anticipated. The days that followed were a blur of passion and secrecy. Adrian was caught in a whirlwind, torn between the intoxicating allure of Celeste and the life he had built with Elise. His lies grew more intricate, his actions more reckless, but every high came with a crushing low. As the weight of his betrayal threatened to consume him, Adrian's descent into temptation was not without consequences. His performance at work began to falter, his relationships with friends and colleagues strained. Elise, though still unaware of the full extent of his deception, sensed the distance between them growing. She tried to reach out, to mend the cracks in their marriage. But Adrian was too far gone, ensnared in a web of his own making. As the months passed, Adrian's world began to unravel. The thrill he had once felt with Celeste was replaced by a suffocating sense of dread. He realized too late that the escape he had sought was nothing more than an illusion, a fleeting distraction from the deeper issues he had refused to confront. One night, as he stood on the balcony of his penthouse, staring at the city lights, Adrian was forced to face the truth. His surrender to temptation had cost him everything he held dear. Elise had discovered his betrayal and left, taking with her the life they had built together. Celeste, sensing his turmoil, had walked away, leaving him alone with his regrets. Adrian's story is a cautionary tale, a reminder of the devastating consequences of surrendering to temptation. It is a story of loss, redemption, and the long, arduous journey of rebuilding a life shattered by a single, irrevocable choice. The night Adrian kissed Celeste for the first time was a turning point. It wasn't planned, or at least, that's how Adrian justified it to himself later. He had been sitting across from her at a dimly lit bar, the jazz music washing over them like a hypnotic wave. Celeste had leaned in close, her voice low and teasing, her fingers brushing his wrist as she laughed at something he said. The world around them blurred until all Adrian could focus on was the curve of her lips and the electricity in her touch. When he finally crossed the line, it wasn't a moment of clarity, but one of complete abandon. Their kiss was electric, charged with months of unspoken longing. Adrian felt alive in a way he hadn't in years. His heart pounded with exhilaration and dread as they parted, her gaze locking onto his with a mixture of triumph and vulnerability. "Now there's no going back," she whispered, her words laced with both seduction and warning. Adrian went home that night to Elise, his stomach a churn of emotions. She was waiting for him in the living room, curled up with a book. Her eyes lit up when she saw him, and the sight twisted something inside him. Elise had always been his constant, a steady, grounding presence in his chaotic world. She deserved better than what he had just done, but the truth was far too ugly to speak aloud. "Late night again?" she asked, closing the book and smiling. "Yeah," Adrian replied, forcing a smile of his own. "Big client meeting ran long." The lie rolled off his tongue with alarming ease. Elise didn't press him. She never did. That trust, that unconditional belief in him, made him hate himself even more. Adrian's life became a delicate balancing act. By day, he was the picture of success and stability, a respected professional, a devoted husband. By night, he was a man living on the edge, consumed by his illicit affair with Celeste. Their meetings were clandestine, filled with passion and danger. They met in hotel rooms, dark corners of the city, and even once in his own car parked on a deserted street. Each stolen moment with her was a rush, but it came at a cost. Elise began to notice the changes in him. He was distracted, his once patient demeanor replaced with irritation and distance. She tried to bridge the growing gap, suggesting weekend getaways or date nights. But Adrian always found an excuse. "Work," he said. "Stress, deadlines." She didn't argue, but the hurt in her eyes was unmistakable. One night, as Adrian lay in bed next to Elise, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was a message from Celeste. "I can't stop thinking about you." Adrian's chest tightened. He knew he should stop, should delete the message and end things before they spiraled further out of control. But he couldn't. Celeste had become an addiction, a need he couldn't satisfy. Celeste, for her part, was everything Elise wasn't. Where Elise was calm and composed, Celeste was wild and unpredictable. She challenged him, pushed him, made him question everything he thought he knew about himself. With her, Adrian felt free from the constraints of his carefully constructed life. But with that freedom came chaos. Their affair was not without its challenges. Celeste was demanding, her desires insatiable. She wanted more of him, more time, more attention, more commitment. Adrian found himself lying not only to Elise but also to Celeste, promising her things he couldn't deliver. He told her he would leave Elise, that they would build a life together. Deep down, he knew he was lying to them both. The guilt became a constant companion, a shadow that followed him everywhere. He began drinking more, staying out later, and losing focus at work. His colleagues noticed that Adrian brushed off their concerns. His performance started to slip, and his boss pulled him aside one day to warn him. "Whatever's going on in your personal life, Adrian, you need to get it under control. You're better than this." Adrian nodded, promising to do better. But the truth was, he didn't know how to fix the mess he had created. It was Elise who finally confronted him. She had found a hotel receipt tucked into his jacket pocket, dated on a night he had claimed to be working late. When she asked him about it, Adrian froze. For a moment, he considered lying again, spinning some tale to explain it away. But the look in Elise's eyes stopped him. She wasn't angry, she was heartbroken. "Adrian," she said softly, her voice trembling, "just tell me the truth." The truth spilled out in fragments, each word more painful than the last. Elise listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. When he was done, she stood and walked out of the room without a word. That night, Adrian slept alone for the first time in years. Elise moved out the next day, leaving Adrian in the echoing silence of their once happy home. Celeste, too, began to pull away. The thrill of their affair had been in the secrecy, the forbidden nature of it. With the truth out in the open, the spark between them began to fade. Adrian was left with nothing but his regrets. His career was in shambles, his reputation tarnished, and the two women he had cared for most were gone. Alone in his penthouse, he stared out at the city that had once seemed so full of promise. He thought about Elise, about the life they had built together, and the love he had taken for granted. He thought about Celeste, and the illusion of freedom she had offered. And he thought about himself, the choices he had made, the lies he had told, the man he had become. In the months that followed, Adrian began the slow, painful process of rebuilding his life. He sought therapy, confronting the deeper issues that had led him to seek escape in the arms of another woman. He reached out to Elise, not to win her back, but to apologize and take responsibility for his actions. Elise listened, her face unreadable. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you, Adrian," she said, "but I hope you find a way to forgive yourself." Those words stayed with him. Forgiveness, Adrian realized, was not something he could ask for. It was something he had to earn. Adrian had always been a man of ambition, even from a young age. Growing up in a modest household where money was tight, he'd learned to associate success with security, and security with happiness. His father, a factory worker, had instilled in him the value of hard work, but his mother had instilled in him something more insidious, the belief that love and approval were conditional, tied to achievement. When Adrian graduated at the top of his class and landed a coveted job in finance, he felt for the first time that he'd proven himself, but the satisfaction was fleeting. As the years passed and his career flourished, the hunger for validation remained, growing like a shadow behind him. He met Elise during his early days at the firm. She had been working as a teacher at the time, radiating warmth and compassion. Elise wasn't like the women Adrian had dated before. She wasn't impressed by his suits or his car. What drew her to him was his passion, his drive, and the vulnerability he tried so hard to hide. For a while, Their love felt uncheckable. Elise grounded Adrian, offering him a sense of home he had never known. But as his career demands grew, so did the distance between them. Adrian became consumed by his work, climbing the corporate ladder with relentless focus. Elise, meanwhile, found herself yearning for a deeper connection, one that Adrian seemed increasingly unable or unwilling to provide. Celeste entered Adrian's life at a critical juncture, when his dissatisfaction with himself and his marriage had reached a boiling point. She wasn't just beautiful, she was magnetic. Her confidence was intoxicating, her presence a sharp contrast to the subdued world Adrian had grown used to. They first met at a charity gala, one of those extravagant events where the city's elite mingled under chandeliers, sipping champagne. Celeste had been standing by the bar, dressed in a sleek black gown that seemed to shimmer under the lights. Adrian had noticed her immediately, but it was she who approached him, her emerald green eyes locking onto his with a boldness that took him off guard. "You don't look like you want to be here," she said, her lips curving into a knowing smile. Adrian laughed, startled by her directness. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who feels the same." Their conversation flowed effortlessly, the hours slipping by as the gala continued around them. By the time they parted ways, Adrian couldn't stop thinking about her. She was everything his life lacked: excitement, unpredictability, a sense of adventure. Adrian didn't plan to pursue Celeste, but their paths kept crossing. Whether it was at work events, networking gatherings, or chance encounters in the city, she always seemed to appear when his resolve was weakest. Their interactions grew bolder, their flirtations more charged. Elise, meanwhile, began to sense that something was amiss. Adrian had become more withdrawn, his moods shifting unpredictably. He spent longer hours at work, his excuses vague and unconvincing. Elise tried to reach out, suggesting they take a weekend trip to reconnect. "I can't," Adrian said one evening, not even looking up from his laptop. "There's too much going on at the office." Elise bit her lip, fighting back the frustration that had been building for months. "Adrian, we need to make time for us. I feel like we're drifting apart." "I know," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "I'll try, Elise. I promise." But the promises were empty, and Elise knew it. The affair began innocently enough, or so Adrian told himself. Late-night phone calls, coffee meetings that stretched into hours, conversations that ventured into deeply personal territory. Celeste had a way of making Adrian feel seen, as though she understood the parts of him he had kept hidden even from Elise. When they finally crossed the line, Adrian was too caught up in the moment to think about the consequences. The guilt came later, like a tidal wave crashing over him as he lay in bed next to Elise, her steady breathing a painful reminder of the life he was betraying. But the guilt wasn't enough to stop him. Each time he met Celeste, he told himself it would be the last. And each time, he found himself drawn back to her, unable to resist the pull. Adrian's double life grew more complicated with each passing week. He became an expert at deception, weaving intricate lies to cover his tracks. But the strain of maintaining the facade began to take its toll. He grew paranoid, constantly checking his phone, deleting messages and rehearsing alibis in his mind. At work, his performance suffered. He missed deadlines, made careless mistakes, and found it increasingly difficult to focus. His boss, a no-nonsense woman named Victoria Hayes, called him into her office one morning. "Adrian, this isn't like you," she said, her tone firm but concerned. "Is everything okay?" "Just a lot on my plate," Adrian replied, forcing a smile. "Well, whatever it is, get it under control. I need you at the top of your game." The warning only added to Adrian's stress. He felt like a man on the edge of a precipice, teetering dangerously close to the abyss. Elise discovered the affair not through a dramatic revelation, but through a series of small, painful clues. The first was a receipt from a luxury hotel, tucked carelessly into Adrian's jacket pocket. Then there were the late-night phone calls, the hushed tones, the unexplained absences. The final blow came when she saw a message flash across his phone screen while he was in the shower. It was from Celeste. "I miss you." Elise felt the air leave her lungs. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen, the weight of her suspicions crashing down on her. When Adrian emerged from the bathroom, she was sitting on the bed, his phone in her hands. "Who is she?" Elise asked, her voice trembling but steady. Adrian froze, his mind racing. For a moment he considered denying it, spinning yet another lie. But the look in Elise's eyes stopped him. "It's not what you think," he began, but the words sounded hollow even to him. "Don't insult me, Adrian," Elise said, her voice breaking. "Just tell me the truth." And so, he did. Adrian sat alone in the quiet living room after Elise stormed out of the apartment. His confession had unraveled years of stability, and the echoes of her sobs still lingered in the air. The life they had built together felt fragile now, like a house of cards finally toppled by his own hand. The weight of his actions hit him like never before. He stared at the remnants of their shared life scattered throughout the room. The framed photographs on the shelves, the knitted throw blanket Elise loved, the small souvenirs from their travels. Every object felt like an accusation. He considered calling her, but he knew it was too soon. She needed time, space, maybe even an escape from the man he had become. Instead, he poured himself a drink and sank into the couch, the amber liquid burning his throat. It didn't help. The fallout wasn't limited to his marriage. Adrian expected to find solace in Celeste, to lose himself in the intoxicating chemistry they shared. But when he met her the following evening, he found her distant, her demeanor guarded. "What's wrong?" Adrian asked, his voice low as they sat across from each other, in the corner of a dimly lit lounge. Celeste sipped her wine and set the glass down carefully. "I heard what happened," she said. "You told Elise?" Adrian nodded, his jaw tightening. "I didn't have a choice. She found out." Celeste tilted her head, her green eyes studying him. "And now what? What does that mean for us?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implication. Adrian had no answer. The truth was, he hadn't thought that far ahead. He had been so consumed by the immediacy of his actions, by the guilt, the lies, the confrontation that he hadn't considered what came next. "I don't know," he admitted, running a hand through his hair. "I need time to figure things out." Celeste's lips curved into a bitter smile. "Time," she repeated. "That's convenient." Her words stung, but Adrian couldn't argue. The tension between them was palpable. And for the first time since their affair began, he saw cracks in the facade. The thrill that had once defined their relationship was gone, replaced by the cold reality of their situation. Adrian's unraveling personal life began bleeding into his professional one. His once sharp focus was dulled by sleepless nights and constant anxiety. Deadlines slipped. Deals fell apart. and his colleagues whispered behind his back. Victoria Hayes, his boss, wasn't one to tolerate failure. She called him into her office again, her tone sharper this time. "This is your second warning, Adrian," she said, her eyes narrowing as she slid a file across the desk. "Your performance has been unacceptable, and it's starting to affect the team. If you can't get your act together, we're going to have to make some hard decisions." Adrian swallowed hard, nodding. "I understand," he said, though he barely did. He left the office feeling hollow, his mind racing with thoughts of how quickly everything was falling apart. His marriage, his career, his sense of self, they were all slipping through his fingers, and he felt powerless to stop it. Elise, meanwhile, was navigating her own storm. She moved out of their shared apartment and stayed with her sister, Rebecca, in a quieter part of the city. Rebecca was fiercely protective, offering Elise both a shoulder to cry on and a constant reminder that she deserved better. "You don't owe him anything," Rebecca said one evening as they sat on the couch, wine glasses in hand. "He betrayed you. He broke your trust. You deserve someone who values you, Elise." Elise nodded, though her heart ached with conflicting emotions. She hated Adrian for what he had done, but she also couldn't ignore the memories of the man she had fallen in love with. Was it possible to hate and love someone at the same time? She started seeing a therapist, someone who helped her untangle the web of emotions that had consumed her since discovering the affair. The therapist encouraged her to focus on herself, to rediscover the parts of her life that had been overshadowed by Adrian's ambition and her role as his wife. Slowly, Elise began to heal. She volunteered more at the community center, rekindled old friendships, and even started painting again, something she hadn't done in years. Each small step forward felt like a victory, a reminder that her life didn't have to revolve around Adrian. As weeks turned into months, Adrian found himself increasingly isolated. Elise refused to take his calls, and Celeste had ended their affair, citing the mess of his life as too much for her to handle. "I didn't sign up for this," she had said during their final conversation. "I wanted excitement, not baggage." Her words lingered long after she left, a painful reminder of how his choices had alienated everyone around him. Alone in his penthouse, Adrian spiraled into despair. The sleek, modern apartment that had once symbolized his success now felt empty and suffocating. He drank more, stayed up late into the night staring at the city skyline, and replayed his mistakes in his mind like a broken record. The guilt was unbearable. He thought about Elise constantly, her smile, her laughter, the way she used to rest her head on his shoulder after a long day. He thought about the life they had planned together, the future they would never have. One morning, after waking up on the couch with a pounding headache and an empty bottle of whiskey on the floor, Adrian made a decision. He couldn't keep living like this. If he wanted any chance at salvaging his life, if not with Elise, then at least for himself he had to change. He started by seeking therapy, something he had always dismissed as unnecessary. Sitting in the therapist's office for the first time, Adrian felt exposed, vulnerable. But as the sessions continued, he began to unpack the deeper issues that had led him to sabotage his own happiness. It wasn't just about the affair, his therapist said during one session. It was about what the affair represented: an escape, a way to avoid facing the dissatisfaction in your life. If you want to move forward, you need to confront those feelings head on. Adrian also began reaching out to Elise, not to win her back, but to apologize and take responsibility for his actions. He wrote her a long letter, pouring his heart onto the page. He didn't expect a response, but writing it felt like a small step toward redemption. Over time, Adrian started rebuilding his life piece by piece. He threw himself into his work, regaining the trust of his colleagues and earning back his reputation. He focused on his health, cutting back on drinking and taking up running as a way to clear his mind. Most importantly, he worked on himself. Therapy helped him understand the patterns and insecurities that had shaped his choices, and he committed to breaking those cycles. Elise, meanwhile, continued to thrive in her own way. She found fulfillment in her volunteer work, surrounded by people who valued her kindness and generosity. Though she still carried scars from her marriage, she no longer let them define her. As Adrian navigated the pain of losing both Elise and Celeste, he found himself at a crossroads. The life he had so meticulously crafted, a life built on ambition, work, and achievement, now seemed empty and meaningless. He had once seen success as a measure of self-worth, a way to validate his existence. Yet, here he was, a man with everything he had ever worked for: success, wealth, status, and yet none of it could fill the emptiness inside him. Adrian spent many nights lying awake, staring at the ceiling. He thought about the person he had been when he first met Elise, the young man full of dreams and idealism. He had promised her the world, the future they would build together. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of those promises. Somewhere between the client meetings, the promotions, and the pressure to perform, he had forgotten what truly mattered: connection, love, and authenticity. In his therapy sessions, Adrian began to uncover the roots of his self-destructive behavior. His therapist, Dr. Olivia Green, was patient, allowing him the space to explore his feelings. He often found himself speaking about his childhood, a topic he had never considered before. "My father was always disappointed in me," Adrian confessed one afternoon, his voice trembling for the first time in years. "He worked hard, and he wanted me to work even harder. But I never felt like I could ever do enough to make him proud." Dr. Green nodded, encouraging him to continue. "How do you think that shaped your view of success?" Adrian paused, the truth sinking in. I thought that if I succeeded, I'd finally earn his approval. But I never did. And when I didn't get it, I started to think maybe I wasn't enough." The revelation hit Adrian like a ton of bricks. He had spent his entire life chasing something external, something he could never reach. In his relentless pursuit of validation, he had neglected his emotional needs, lost sight of the people who loved him, and ultimately lost himself. Meanwhile, Elise was also facing a journey of her own. The days following her discovery of Adrian's affair were painful, but as time passed, she began to feel a growing sense of liberation. She had always been the supportive partner, the one who prioritized Adrian's needs above her own. Now, she was forced to confront the uncomfortable truth that she had neglected her own desires and ambitions in the process. In the weeks following her departure from their apartment, Elise turned inward. She took long walks, finding solace in nature and reflection. Her sister, Rebecca, remained a strong pillar of support, but Elise knew that the real work would come from within. One afternoon, Elise decided to revisit something she had abandoned years ago: painting. It had once been her passion, a creative outlet that had given her a sense of purpose. But after she and Adrian had gotten married, her time for herself had diminished. She had always put his career first, his needs first. But now, Painting became a way for her to reclaim herself. The first brushstroke was awkward, but as she continued, something inside her began to heal. It wasn't just about the art. It was about the process of rediscovery. Elise was no longer defined by her role as Adrian's wife. She was Elise, a woman with her own desires, her own passions, and her own worth. But as much as Elise tried to move forward, Adrian's shadow lingered. She often found herself thinking about their years, together, the good and the bad. Despite the pain, she still loved him. The question was whether love was enough to rebuild what had been shattered. Adrian knew that if he wanted to rebuild anything, it had to start with forgiveness. But forgiveness wasn't something he could ask for. He had learned that through his therapy sessions. Dr. Green had helped him realize that forgiveness was a personal process, one that began with self-forgiveness. "I betrayed Elise," Adrian admitted one afternoon, his voice barely above a whisper. "I betrayed her trust in the worst way. But I don't know how to forgive myself. I don't know how to make this right." Dr. Green looked at him calmly. "Forgiving yourself is often harder than seeking forgiveness from others. But it's the first step to healing. It starts with taking responsibility for your actions and understanding why you made the choices you did." Adrian spent weeks reflecting on this. He thought about Celeste, their affair, the lies he told, and how he had justified everything at the time. He thought about Elise's pain, the look in her eyes when she found out, and how he had destroyed the trust they had built over the years. He began writing in a journal, pouring his thoughts and regrets onto the page. It was cathartic, but it also highlighted how far he had strayed from the man he once wanted to be. Each entry was a small step toward healing, though it often felt like he was running in place, unable to escape the consequences of his actions. While Adrian struggled with his guilt, Elise also found herself at a crossroads. She had built a life on the foundation of her love for Adrian, but now that foundation had crumbled. Yet, as she reconnected with her own passions, she began to wonder if she had been relying too heavily on someone else for her sense of worth. One evening, as she sat painting in her new apartment, Elise received a call from her old college friend, Hannah. Hannah had always been a free spirit, someone who had encouraged Elise to follow her heart, even when she was with Adrian. "You've been through so much, Elise," Hannah said during their conversation. "But I can't help but feel like you've lost yourself in the process. Maybe it's time to start focusing on what you want for your future, not just healing from the past." The words hit Elise hard. She had spent so many years focused on being a supportive wife that she had lost track of who she was outside of that role. It was a difficult realization, but one that set her on a new path. Elise began setting new goals for herself, ones that didn't revolve around Adrian. She took up a painting class at a local art gallery, something she had always wanted to do, but had never made time for. She also started traveling more, visiting places that inspired her and gave her a sense of adventure. Adrian's path toward redemption was not easy. As his therapy sessions continued, he began to peel back the layers of his emotional wounds. He learned to identify the patterns that had led to his infidelity, the need for external validation, the fear of vulnerability, the belief that success could fill an inner void. He also knew that the road to Elise's forgiveness would be long and uncertain. She had made it clear that she wasn't sure whether she could ever trust him again, and Adrian couldn't blame her. One day, after months of no contact, Adrian decided to write her a letter. It wasn't a letter begging for reconciliation, but one of profound accountability. He wrote about his mistakes, his regrets, and the journey he had begun to embark on. He told her that he understood the gravity of his betrayal and the impact it had on her life. He made it clear that he didn't expect her to forgive him immediately, but he wanted her to know that he was trying to become a better man, regardless of what the future held for them. He left the letter at her doorstep and walked away without looking back. Elise read the letter in the quiet solitude of her apartment. She felt a deep sadness as she read his words. But there was also something else, a flicker of hope. Adrian's apology was sincere, and she could feel the pain in his words. Yet, she wasn't sure if forgiveness was possible. In the days that followed, Elise thought long and hard about the life she had shared with Adrian, and about the woman she had become without him. She realized that she had grown stronger, more independent and more confident in her own identity. She wasn't sure if she would ever fully forgive Adrian, but she knew that she had forgiven herself. She had learned to prioritize her own well-being, and that was something no one could take away. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. Elise was no longer the same woman who had once defined herself by her marriage. She was reclaiming her own life, piece by piece. As weeks bled into months, Adrian found himself ensnared in a constant battle with his own demons. He had taken the first step toward redemption by acknowledging his faults in therapy, that there was no quick fix. Healing was an arduous, messy process, and the ache in his chest remained ever present, a reminder of the damage he had caused. His life felt like a puzzle he couldn't piece together. Adrian began waking up earlier, forcing himself to exercise, as Dr. Green had suggested. The physical exhaustion helped him sleep better at night, but it didn't erase the guilt that clouded his thoughts. He began journaling every morning, focusing on small victories, like how he managed to get out of bed and face another day. But these victories felt hollow, as though they were mere distractions from the chaos inside him. He also revisited his childhood memories, digging deeper into the emotional scars he had long ignored. His father's expectations had weighed heavily on him for most of his life. Growing up in a house where success was synonymous with worth, Adrian had internalized the belief that nothing he did would ever be enough unless it was exceptional. His mother, though loving, had always supported his father's harsh standards, leaving Adrian to seek validation in every corner of his adult life. He realized now that his desire for approval had shaped his every decision, leading him to betray Elise. But as Adrian began to piece together these fragments of his past, he couldn't ignore the nagging question: what was the point of all this? What was the true measure of success? One day, he found himself sitting in a cafe after a long therapy session, staring out the window. His mind was blank, the weight of the question heavy on his chest. As he absent-mindedly stirred his coffee, he overheard a conversation between two older men sitting at a nearby table. "I used to chase all kinds of things when I was young," one man said. "Money, power, respect. But when you get older, you realize none of that means a thing if you've lost the people you care about." The words hit Adrian like a shockwave. He had spent his life chasing external validation, working long hours, sacrificing his personal relationships, believing that success and status would bring him happiness. But now, with everything crumbling around him, he understood that those things meant nothing if they came at the cost of love and trust. His thoughts shifted to Elise. What was it that he truly wanted from her? Was it forgiveness? Redemption? Or was it just the peace that came with knowing she could find happiness again, whether with him or without him? As much as Adrian struggled with his own journey of self-forgiveness, he knew that seeking forgiveness from Elise was another impossible mountain to climb. He hadn't heard from her since he left the letter on her doorstep, and each passing day felt like a missed opportunity. He had no right to ask for her forgiveness, but he also knew he couldn't just sit back and wait. Adrian decided to send Elise a text, a simple message that wasn't about reconciliation, but about acknowledging her pain. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want you to know that I am truly sorry for the hurt I've caused you." The message read, "I am working every day to become the person I should have been. You don't owe me anything, but I hope one day you'll find peace, with or without me." The message was short and to the point. It wasn't an apology wrapped in expectations. It was an acknowledgement of the deep scars he had left, and a plea that she too could eventually find healing. Days passed with no response, and the silence gnawed at him. He feared that his message had been nothing more than a hollow attempt to absolve his guilt, but he had no other way of reaching her. Elise's life was unfolding in a way she had never expected, but she was beginning to see it as an opportunity for growth. Despite the profound sadness she felt over Adrian's betrayal, she had given so much of herself to their marriage, had been the epitome of devotion and support. But now, standing alone, she realized just how much of her identity had been tethered to someone else. At first, the solitude was suffocating. She spent hours reflecting on the life she had left behind. What was she without Adrian? Who was she beyond the role of wife? The answer was unclear at first, but as she continued with her painting, something began to shift. The colors she once struggled to bring to life on the canvas now flowed effortlessly. She had rediscovered a part of herself that she thought was lost. Forever her creative spirit, her independence, her passion. She began taking longer trips, visiting art galleries in different cities, exploring parts of the world she had always dreamed of seeing. On these trips, she met new people, artists, travelers, strangers, and each encounter brought a fresh perspective. She discovered how different life could be when she wasn't weighed down by expectations, when she wasn't living for someone else's approval. One evening, while traveling in Florence, Elise sat at a small cafe, overlooking the Arno River. As she watched the sun dip below the horizon, a sense of peace washed over her. It was as if the pain she had carried for so long was beginning to dissipate, replaced by a sense of self-empowerment. As she sat there, contemplating the future, Elise reflected on the lessons she had learned. Forgiveness was important, but it wasn't just about forgiving Adrian. It was about forgiving herself for allowing herself to be defined by someone else's actions. It was about reclaiming the parts of her that had been buried under years of compromises. After months of introspection, therapy, and small steps toward healing, Adrian came to a realization. His work and achievements could no longer be the foundation of his self-worth. Success was no longer a badge to wear with pride. It was just a series of milestones that distracted him from the things that truly mattered. His work no longer satisfied him the way it once had. The empty feeling in his chest never quite went away. Adrian began spending more time outside the corporate world. He took up volunteering at a local shelter, a decision that surprised him. At first, it was awkward and uncomfortable, but over time, he found himself connecting with the people there. Their stories of hardship and resilience reminded him of the very things he had lost sight of: humility, empathy, and the value of human connection. He also began mentoring younger employees at his company, teaching them not just about the work, but about the importance of balance in life. He encouraged them to prioritize their mental health and personal relationships over the relentless pursuit of career success. It felt like a small victory, a quiet redemption, but it gave him purpose, something he had desperately sought for so long. As time continued to pass, both Adrian and Elise found themselves at a crossroads. Adrian had worked tirelessly to rebuild his life, to become a better version of himself. But the past couldn't be erased. He could only move forward with a deeper understanding of who he was, acknowledging his mistakes while trying to right his wrongs. The process of redemption was slow, painful, and often felt like 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Elise, on the other hand, had evolved into someone new. She had reclaimed her independence and rebuilt her life from the ashes of their marriage. The woman she had become was strong, self-assured, and no longer defined by anyone else's expectations. Yet, despite all the progress, there was still a part of her that wondered about Adrian. She didn't miss him in the way she once had, but she wondered if he could truly change. One day, after returning from a trip abroad, Elise found herself at a coffee shop in the city. As she waited for her order, she noticed Adrian across the room. He hadn't seen her yet, and she hesitated, wondering if she should approach him. Her heart beat a little faster, not from love but from the weight of the past. After a few moments, she walked over to him. Adrian looked up, his eyes filled with surprise and something else, guilt. Perhaps, but also something that resembled hope. "Elise," he said softly, "I didn't expect to see you." She smiled faintly, unsure of what to say. "I didn't either. But here we are." They both stood there for a moment, the weight of their shared history hanging in the air. Then Elise spoke. "I've spent a lot of time figuring out who I am now without you. I've forgiven myself for everything I let go of, for everything I ignored. But I don't know if I can forgive you." Adrian nodded, his voice low. "I don't expect you to, but I needed you to know that I'm not the same man I was. I'm trying." She met his gaze. "Trying doesn't undo what you've done, but it's a start." They stood in silence for a few moments, neither of them rushing to fill the space with words. It was a tentative beginning, the possibility of something new, but only time would tell if forgiveness and healing could truly take root. Months passed, and Adrian continued his quest for self-improvement. Every day felt like an uphill battle, as though he were running a marathon with no end in sight. He had gained some clarity in his therapy sessions, but it wasn't enough to wash away the stain of his betrayal. He had learned to identify the root causes of his actions, but understanding why he had made the choices he didn't change the fact that he had hurt the woman he loved. He had taken up volunteering, but even in the midst of helping others, he often found himself lost in his thoughts. His hands, which had once been so confident in closing business deals and sealing important contracts, now trembled slightly as he served meals to people at the shelter. It was a humbling experience, one that made him realize just how disconnected he had been from the world around him. Success, wealth, and status hadn't given him happiness. They had only alienated him from the things that truly mattered: human connection, empathy, and genuine love. Adrian also began journaling with more intensity, trying to capture the raw emotions that had long been buried inside him. He wrote about his childhood, the pressure to succeed, the sense of inadequacy he had always felt in his father's eyes. He wrote about his first encounter with Elise, how she had been a light in his otherwise dark world, how her love had made him feel worthy. But somewhere along the way, he had lost himself again. One night, after another long therapy session, Adrian sat on the balcony of his apartment, staring out into the city. The lights of the buildings glimmered like distant stars. And for the first time in months, Adrian wondered if he would ever feel whole again. Could he ever find peace? Could he truly change? He remembered something Elise had once said to him. When they first started dating, "Love isn't about perfection, Adrian. It's about showing up even when it's hard. It's about making the choice to be there for each other, even when everything else feels like it's falling apart." At the time, he had brushed it off, thinking that love was about grand gestures and sweeping declarations. But now, in the silence of his apartment, he realized that Elise had been right all along. Love was not about perfection. It was about the work, the everyday effort, and the vulnerability to face the mistakes and grow together. But was it too late? Could he still prove to her that he had learned that lesson? Elise, too, had come a long way in her healing. She had spent months building a new life for herself, one that wasn't tied to Adrian's image of her as his wife. She had rediscovered her love for painting, traveling to new cities, and reconnecting with the parts of herself she had long neglected. Yet, as much as she tried to push forward, she couldn't help but feel a lingering sense of emptiness. The emptiness wasn't because of her divorce, but because, deep down, she still carried a love for Adrian, a love that was tangled with pain and betrayal. She had reached a point where she was beginning to believe that she might never fully forgive him, that the wound he had caused would never fully heal. But as she painted one evening in her apartment, surrounded by the colors and textures of her latest creation, she felt something shift. It was as if the weight of the past was lifting, bit by bit. For the first time in months, Elise felt like she was not only healing but transforming. She wasn't just recovering from a loss. She was evolving into someone new. She had spent so many years prioritizing Adrian's needs, setting aside her own desires for the sake of their marriage. But now she was carving out space for herself. Her relationships with friends had deepened as well. She began opening up to people she had once kept at a distance, allowing herself to be vulnerable. The friendships she had built gave her the support she needed to realize that her worth was not tied to her relationship status. She had the power to build a life filled with purpose and joy, and it didn't depend on anyone else. One day, Elise received a letter from a gallery in Paris, accepting one of her paintings for an upcoming exhibition. The letter felt like a culmination of everything she had worked for in the past few months. It was a reminder that she was capable of more than she had ever imagined. She didn't need Adrian's approval to succeed or to feel proud of herself. She was building her own legacy, one that was uniquely hers. But as Elise stood on her balcony that evening, looking at the city lights, she found herself thinking of Adrian. She thought of their shared memories, the good times and the love they once had. She had no illusions about what he had done, but there was a part of her that still cared deeply for him. It was during one of these moments of reflection that Adrian found himself standing outside Elise's apartment building. He had returned to the city after spending some time away, working on himself and volunteering at a shelter. He had gained some clarity and peace, but he knew that there was still a huge chasm between him and Elise. He had apologized, sent letters, and tried to rebuild his life, but it felt like none of it was enough. He wasn't sure if he could ever make up for the hurt he had caused. He thought back to the first time he had met Elise. She had been a breath of fresh air in his life, a beacon of warmth and understanding. She had seen the real him, the flawed, vulnerable, an ambitious man who longed for love and acceptance. But somewhere along the way, he had lost sight of her, and in doing so, lost himself. Was it too late to fix things? Could he still win back her trust? Or was he forever marked by his betrayal? Adrian wasn't sure, but he knew that he couldn't live with the uncertainty any longer. He needed to see her again, to speak to her face to face. Adrian stood at the entrance to the building, his heart pounding in his chest. He had rehearsed this moment countless times in his head, but now that he was here, standing on the precipice of everything he had lost, his confidence faltered. Should he knock? Should he just leave a message? Before he could decide, he heard footsteps behind him. He turned and saw Elise approaching, her gaze meeting his. There was no hostility in her eyes, but neither was there warmth. She had come to terms with their past, but the scars were still visible, even if they were hidden beneath a veil of composure. "Adrian," she said softly, her voice carrying both caution and curiosity. "I didn't expect to see you here." The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and for a moment, neither of them knew what to say. Adrian swallowed hard, his throat dry. "I know I don't deserve this," Adrian said, his voice trembling slightly. "But I wanted to see you. I wanted to apologize again for everything I've done. And I wanted you to know that I'm trying to change. I know I've hurt you, and I can't undo it. But I'm not the same person I was." Elise looked at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his face as though trying to gauge the sincerity of his words. She could feel the weight of the past in his voice, but she also knew that actions spoke louder than words. She had spent so many years forgiving him, trying to fix their relationship, but now it was different. She was different. "I appreciate your apology, Adrian," Elise said quietly. "But I've learned that forgiveness is something I have to do for myself, not for you. I can't keep living in the past, waiting for you to change. I have to move forward with or without you." There was a finality in her tone that sent a sharp pang through Adrian's chest. But in her words, he also heard something else, a sense of strength, a clarity that she had found through her pain. She was no longer the woman who had once defined herself by their relationship. She was Elise, a woman who had reclaimed her life. "I understand," Adrian said, his voice barely a whisper. "And I hope one day you'll be able to find peace with everything that's happened." Elise nodded, her eyes softening. "I already have, in my own way." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Adrian standing there in the stillness of the evening, feeling both lost and free. Adrian's life had shifted in ways he hadn't imagined possible. With each passing day, he focused on small steps toward betterment, knowing there was no magical moment of redemption that would instantly make up for his betrayal. His internal turmoil was no longer an occasional occurrence. It was constant. But now, the pain wasn't paralyzing. It was the painful, necessary companion to growth. Every time Adrian entered the shelter to volunteer, he was reminded of the vast range of human experience. There were moments when he felt immense pride in the work he was doing, but those moments were often interrupted by reminders of how fragile and fleeting life could be. He saw the faces of people who had been discarded by society, people who had lost everything yet managed to rise again, showing a resilience Adrian hadn't thought was possible. He came to realize that true strength wasn't about accumulating wealth or titles, as he had once believed. It was about vulnerability, about facing one's imperfections and choosing to be better in spite of the odds. The people at the shelter, many of whom had faced unimaginable hardship, had become his teachers, even though they might not have realized it. One evening, after serving a hot meal to a group of guests at the shelter, Adrian sat down at one of the tables, feeling the weight of his thoughts. An older woman with graying hair and weathered skin took a seat across from him. Her eyes were sharp, but there was a kindness in them that spoke of wisdom earned through years of survival. "Been volunteering long?" she asked, her voice raspy but warm. Adrian hesitated, then nodded. "A few months now." "It's harder than I thought it would be." The woman smiled gently. "Hard is what makes it worthwhile. You know, when life gets tough, people tend to look for things to fix, to control. But sometimes, the only thing you can really control is how you react." Adrian's mind whirled. That's actually what I've been struggling with. I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything work. People, situations, and I've hurt the ones I love in the process. The woman studied him for a moment, then nodded knowingly. "We all do. But what matters is what you do now. You can't undo the past, but you can choose to be someone different moving forward." Adrian sat with her words for a long time, contemplating their truth. He hadn't been able to undo the harm he had done to Elise, but maybe, just maybe, he could become the man she had always deserved. And if not her, at least he could be a man worthy of his own respect. Elise, too, found herself on a journey of self-discovery that went beyond her relationship with Adrian. Her decision to embrace her independence had been a slow and deliberate one that unfolded with quiet moments of realization. It wasn't just about leaving the past behind. It was about building a future where she was in control. As her art flourished, Elise began experimenting with new styles and techniques. The paintings that had once been filled with uncertainty now held a vibrancy she had never known. Each stroke of the brush felt like a reclaiming of herself, an assertion of her creativity and her right to live fully, free from the weight of the past. One afternoon, as she was painting in her apartment, she received an email that made her heart race. It was from the gallery in Paris that had accepted her work for the upcoming exhibition. They were offering her the opportunity to showcase more of her pieces. The email was filled with praise for her work, and Elise felt a wave of warmth spread through her. She had done it. She had built this life on her own. But even in her success, there was a lingering thought. Did Adrian know about the exhibit? Would he ever see her work displayed in one of the most prestigious galleries in Europe? It was a fleeting thought, one that she quickly dismissed, but it carried with it the bitter sweetness of what had been lost. Her heart still carried remnants of the love she had once felt for him, but she no longer let it define her. Elise also deepened her relationships with the friends who had supported her through the darkest moments. She had started attending social gatherings again, something she hadn't done for a long time. There was a new sense of freedom in these interactions. She was no longer the woman who was always waiting for someone else's approval. She was Elise whole, complete, and capable of forging her own path. Yet, even as her independence flourished, she couldn't deny the curiosity she felt. When she heard about Adrian's volunteer work, it was strange to feel any interest in his life, given the hurt he had caused her. But something in her couldn't completely shut the door. Maybe it was the hope that he had changed, that he had found the same kind of growth she had. Or maybe it was the remnants of love that still clung to her heart, refusing to let go completely. Months passed. Adrian continued his work at the shelter, and Elise continued to build her career. Their lives, once so intertwined, now felt like two parallel lines that occasionally crossed paths. One afternoon, as Elise was walking through the park near her apartment, she spotted someone sitting on a bench reading a book. For a moment, she couldn't place the figure, but as she walked closer, she realized it was Adrian. Her heart skipped a beat, and she paused, unsure of what to do. It had been months since their brief conversation, and much had changed since then. He hadn't contacted her in all this time, and she had accepted that. Seeing him now, unexpectedly, was like a shock to the system. Adrian looked up as if sensing her presence. Their eyes met, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Adrian's face was softer than she remembered, more peaceful, though still carrying the weight of years of mistakes. He set the book down on the bench and stood. "Elise," he said, his voice tentative. She nodded, unsure of what to say. Her mind was racing, but she felt strangely calm. "Hi, Adrian." He took a deep breath. "I didn't expect to see you here. I've been working at the shelter, and I walk through this park sometimes to clear my head." "I know," Elise said quietly. "I've heard. You're doing good work." A silence fell between them, heavier this time, as the years of shared history lingered in the air. Adrian hesitated, then spoke again. "I know I don't have the right to ask for anything from you, but I've been working on myself. I'm not the man I was before. Elise, I can't undo what I did, but I wanted you to know that I've changed. I'm not perfect, but I'm trying to be better." Elise met his gaze, searching his eyes for the sincerity she needed to see. Part of her wanted to believe him, but another part of her wondered if this was just another version of the man who had broken her trust. "I've heard that," she said softly, "and I believe that you've changed. But change doesn't erase the past. It doesn't take away the pain." Adrian's face softened with understanding. "I know. I don't expect you to forget or to forgive me right now. But I wanted to apologize again. And I wanted you to know that I've learned what really matters. I've learned that love isn't about perfection or control. It's about showing up and being vulnerable." Elise looked away, her heart caught between the pain of the past and the possibility of something new. She had rebuilt herself. She had learned to stand on her own, and she no longer needed Adrian to define her. But the remnants of their shared love tugged at her, unwilling to let go entirely. "I've learned a lot too," Elise said after a long pause. "About who I am without you. About what I need to feel whole." "I understand," Adrian replied quietly. "I don't want to disrupt your peace. I just want you to know that I'll always care for you, and I'll always be here if you need me." She nodded, a small but significant gesture. "Thank you. I hope you find what you're looking for, Adrian." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Adrian standing alone on the park bench. As she walked, Elise felt a strange mixture of relief and sadness. She had finally let go of the expectation that Adrian would be the one to save her. And in doing so, she had saved herself. Adrian watched her leave, the weight of her words settling deep within him. He had come here to seek reconciliation, but he realized that reconciliation didn't always mean coming back together. Sometimes it meant letting go. As he sat back down on the bench, Adrian thought about the woman. Elise had become the strength she had found in herself, her ability to create a life that was hers and hers alone. He thought about his own growth, how much he had learned from the people at the shelter, and the realization that peace could only come through acceptance, not through constant striving. In that moment, Adrian understood that healing wasn't about returning to what had been. It was about moving forward, no matter how difficult that might be. And he knew that for both him and Elise, the journey was far from over. They had learned the hard way that sometimes love meant walking away. Not because the love wasn't real, but because both of them needed to find peace on their own terms. And with that understanding, Adrian felt a weight lift from his chest. He wasn't sure what the future would hold, but for the first time in a long while, he felt hopeful. Adrian's days were often punctuated by deep moments of introspection. As time passed, he felt an increasing sense of weightlessness, a feeling he hadn't experienced in years. It wasn't freedom in the sense that he had everything figured out, or that the ghosts of the past had completely dissipated. It was a more quiet understanding, an acceptance of the person he was and the mistakes he had made, and the realization that his value was not tied to his past actions. He had spent the last few months in therapy, gradually confronting the roots of his behavior. The therapy wasn't a quick fix. In fact, there were days when it felt like the wound was being reopened, the scabs being torn off, and the pain was raw again. But Adrian had come to understand that this pain was a necessary part of the healing process. Every session, every tear, every moment of self-doubt was part of the difficult but essential journey toward forgiveness, not from others, but from himself. One particular afternoon, after a difficult session with his therapist, Adrian decided to take a walk through the park near his apartment. The sunlight filtered softly through the trees, casting dappled shadows on the path ahead. As he walked, he observed the way people interacted with one another, couples holding hands, families laughing, children playing. It was a reminder of how much he had taken for granted in his pursuit of success. Adrian's thoughts turned to Elise, the woman he had loved so deeply, and the woman he had so carelessly hurt. He often wondered if he would ever be able to fully make amends for what he had done. But more importantly, he wondered if he had truly changed in a way that would allow him to be better, not just for her, but for himself. When they had been together, he had always defined his worth through external validation, through his job, his wealth, his ability to control situations. But now, he understood that real worth came from within, and it came from the courage to face one's own flaws and do something about them. For the first time in his life, Adrian wasn't afraid of confronting the darkest parts of himself. He was no longer the man who lived in denial, unwilling to acknowledge his weaknesses. Instead, he was becoming the man who could face the consequences of his actions, understand them, and grow from them. He had started practicing mindfulness, and though it was difficult at first, he found solace in the quiet moments of meditation. The stillness allowed him to sit with his thoughts without rushing to push them away, without trying to fix everything at once. This was not a journey of instant redemption, but one of slow, gradual transformation. Elisa's life had become an exploration of freedom and self-expression. After months of focusing on herself and her art, she began to experience the profound peace that came with doing what she loved. Her paintings were no longer filled with the tension of unresolved emotions or the weight of past disappointments. They were full of life, color, and complexity expressions of the woman she was becoming. She had started painting more abstract pieces, ones that reflected her inner world, the layers of joy, pain, hope, and fear that made up her existence. For so long, she had tried to fit into the mold that Adrian's expectations had created for her. She had done everything to be the perfect partner, to be someone who could love him enough to heal their relationship. But now, Elise was learning that true healing didn't come from another person. It came from embracing her own complexities and allowing herself to be as imperfect as the art she created. Her gallery exhibition in Paris had been a pivotal moment in her artistic journey. The acclaim she received from critics and visitors alike filled her with pride. But it wasn't the validation that mattered. It was the realization that she could do this on her own, that she didn't need anyone's approval to feel fulfilled. Her art had become a language of its own, speaking the truth she had once struggled to express. In the months following her exhibition, Elise's work had evolved even further. She found herself painting not just with her hands, but with her heart. Her canvases became a mirror of the soul, the swirling emotions of joy and sorrow, of liberation and fear. It was in these moments of creation that she truly felt alive, and she no longer looked to the past to define who she was. Despite her success, there were still days when she felt a deep ache, longing for something she couldn't quite put into words. It wasn't about missing Adrian, but about missing the version of herself she had left behind. When she first started to build a life for him, Elise had spent years burying her own desires for the sake of their relationship, and now she was working to uncover those parts of herself again. She also began to cultivate deeper friendships. She reached out to old friends she had neglected during her marriage, and she made new connections with other artists who shared her passion for creativity and self-expression. These friendships were becoming an essential part of her growth. They were a reminder that she wasn't alone, that she didn't have to walk this path of self-discovery in isolation. Months passed and life moved on, but both Adrian and Elise still found themselves reflecting on their past, on the love they had shared, the mistakes they had made, and the lessons they had learned. Their paths had diverged, but the echoes of their relationship still lingered in the background, like distant memories of a life once lived. One fateful day, their lives crossed again in an unexpected way. Adrian had been volunteering at the shelter and decided to take a walk in the park nearby, something he had done many times before. He had been thinking about how far he had come in his journey and how, in some ways, he had let go of the past. He was no longer consumed by guilt, but instead, he focused on living with integrity, making choices that reflected the man he had worked hard to become. As he walked, he saw Elise sitting on a bench, a book in her hands, her gaze lost in the pages. It was a moment that felt both surreal and inevitable. Adrian stood frozen for a moment, unsure of what to do. His heart raced, his thoughts clouded by the complex mix of emotions that always seemed to arise. When he saw her, Elise looked up at him, her eyes widening slightly in surprise. The tension between them was palpable, but there was also a sense of calm, an understanding that this moment was a natural part of their journey. "Adrian," she said softly, her voice steady. There was no bitterness in her tone, but neither was there the warmth she had once shown him. There was simply a quiet acknowledgement of the past. "Hi, Elise," he replied, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I didn't expect to see you here. I've been coming to this park more often," she explained. setting her book down on the bench beside her. "I find peace in the stillness here." Adrian sat down on the bench beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. There was no urgency in their interaction, no desperate need to reconcile. Instead, it felt like a moment of reflection, of mutual understanding. Both of them had come so far, and though their paths were no longer aligned, there was a sense of shared wisdom between them. "I've been thinking a lot about everything," Adrian said after a pause. "About you, about us, and I realized that I've spent so much time wishing I could go back and change things. But I can't. I can only be who I am now." Elise looked at him, her expression softening. "I know," she said quietly. "I've thought about the past too. I don't want to be stuck in it anymore, Adrian. I spent so much time trying to understand why things happened the way they did. But now, I'm learning to accept them, to accept myself." Adrian nodded, feeling a strange sense of peace settle over him. This conversation was different from the ones they'd had before. There was no anger, no blame. There was only understanding. "I'm glad you found peace," Adrian said, his voice filled with sincerity. "I'm still working on finding mine, but I'm getting there. And I hope you find even more happiness than you ever thought possible." Elise smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and relief in her eyes. "I'm already on that path, Adrian. And I think you are too." For a few moments they sat in silence, watching the people pass by, each lost in their own thoughts. It was clear that neither of them was waiting for something to change. They had both found their own way, and that was enough. As they parted ways that afternoon, there was no grand gesture, no promises to stay in touch. Instead, there was simply a quiet understanding that they had both evolved. The love they had once shared was no longer a defining force in their lives. It was a chapter in their stories, but it was no longer the whole story. Adrian had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to project an image of strength and invincibility. For years, he had believed that power, whether through wealth, success, or influence, was the key to a fulfilling life. Yet, as he walked deeper into his own healing, Adrian realized how misguided that belief had been. His success, the things he once thought defined him, were merely masks that covered up his deepest insecurities. One evening, as he was working late at the shelter, his thoughts turned inward again. The building was quiet now, with only the soft hum of the refrigerators in the kitchen and the rustle of paperwork in the office. Adrian sat alone at the desk, going over reports about the shelter's needs. He had always been meticulous in his work, but tonight, he found it hard to focus. His mind kept drifting back to the day he and Elise had parted ways, the moment that had marked the beginning of a new chapter in both their lives. He had replayed that day over and over, wondering if there was anything he could have said or done differently. But deep down, Adrian knew that it wasn't about the words. It was about his actions, the lies, the manipulation, the emotional distance he had created in their relationship. The realization stung more than it had in the past. His mistakes weren't just errors in judgment. They were part of the person he had been. Someone who had prioritized his own ego over the woman he loved. There were moments when Adrian felt that he had done everything right, that he was making progress, and that redemption was within reach. But then, there were nights like this, where the guilt would rise again, overwhelming him. The faces of the people at the shelter, those who had lost so much and yet continued to fight for their dignity, served as a stark contrast to the man he had been. They didn't have the luxury of hiding from their struggles. They faced their challenges head-on. And that resilience stirred something deep within Adrian. The path he had chosen was not easy. It wasn't a path that would give him instant rewards or public recognition. But Adrian had come to understand that true. Redemption wasn't about earning forgiveness from others. It was about earning it from himself. One evening, during a particularly difficult therapy session, his therapist had asked him to visualize his future, to imagine a life where he had healed, where he no longer carried the burden of shame and regret. Adrian had struggled with that exercise. He had never allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't clouded by guilt. But that night, as he sat at his desk, staring at the papers in front of him, he allowed himself to picture a version of himself, one who wasn't defined by his mistakes, but by his actions moving forward. It was a small moment, but it felt like a breakthrough. Adrian knew that the road to healing would never be linear. There would be setbacks, days where the old patterns would try to creep back in. But he also knew that, for the first time in his life, he was willing to face them head-on. As Elise continued to pour herself into her art, she found herself growing in ways she hadn't anticipated. Each brushstroke on the canvas was a form of expression, a reflection of the emotional depth she had long kept hidden. There was a rawness to her work now, a vulnerability that she hadn't fully allowed herself to explore before. Her art had always been a form of escape, a way to process the world around her. But now, it had become a conduit for understanding herself, a way to channel her grief, her hopes and her fears. Her latest series of paintings, entitled Fragments of Self, depicted human forms that were broken and pieced, together with jagged lines and bold splashes of color. It was her most ambitious project yet, a direct reflection of the disintegration and reconstruction of her identity. Elise had spent so many years trying to fit herself into the mold of who she thought she should be for others, especially for Adrian, that she had never taken the time to truly explore who she was, what she needed, and what she wanted from life. The process of creating these pieces was cathartic. There were moments when Elise felt completely overwhelmed by the emotions that bubbled up as she painted. At times, she found herself crying, her tears falling onto the canvas as she worked. But she also realized that this was part of her healing, a way of reclaiming her power and expressing the emotions she had once kept buried. During this time, Elise's art garnered the attention of several prestigious galleries. Invitations to exhibit her work came in, including one from a renowned gallery in Milan. The opportunity to showcase her work internationally was a milestone she had dreamed of for years, but it also made her pause. Elise realized that her success wasn't just about the accolades or recognition. It was about the freedom she had found in herself, the courage to stand on her own, and trust in her own abilities. One afternoon, as she was preparing for her exhibition in Milan, Elise received a call from a close friend who had seen one of her recent paintings. "Elise," her friend said, "your work has changed. It's not just art anymore. It's a statement. People are going to look at your paintings and see something deeper. You've tapped into something profound." Her friend's words stayed with her as she finished the final touches on her pieces. Elise had never thought of herself as a visionary, but now she saw that her art was more than just a reflection of her past. It was a reflection of her future. It was a statement of strength, of transformation, and of the beauty that could arise from pain. But even with all her success, Elise still found herself wondering about Adrian. She had spent so much time building her own life that she hadn't allowed herself to truly acknowledge how deeply his absence had affected her. She wasn't seeking him out or hoping for reconciliation. But there was still moments when his memory crept into her thoughts, like an echo she couldn't silence. Yet, in those moments, Elise reminded herself of how far she had come. She had healed in ways that were not just visible but deeply personal. She had learned to trust herself, to rely on her own strength, and to create a life that was entirely her own. Months passed, and the weight of time seemed to shift between Adrian and Elise. Both had grown, both had healed, and yet their paths seemed to remain parallel. It wasn't until one fateful evening, when Elise returned to her hometown to visit her family, that their paths intersected once more. Adrian had been spending the afternoon at the shelter, helping with a community event, when he received an unexpected message. A text from a mutual friend, informing him that Elise was in town for the weekend. The message was simple, just an update, but it stirred something deep within him. Adrian hadn't expected to hear from her again, nor had he imagined that their paths would cross so soon. But now, with her so close, he couldn't help but feel a sense of anticipation mixed with anxiety. He thought about reaching out, but the hesitation was overwhelming. What would he say? How would they even begin to approach the complexities of their past? But deep down, Adrian knew that there was only one thing that mattered now: honesty. Later that evening, as he walked through the park near his apartment, he spotted a figure sitting on the same bench where they had last spoken. Elise had changed in ways that were both subtle and profound. She looked more at peace, more assured of herself. "Hey," Adrian said softly, standing a few feet away from her. His voice was gentle, cautious, as if testing the waters of their shared history. Elise turned to face him, her eyes calm, but filled with the weight of all they had been through. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but rather filled with the understanding that words couldn't undo the past. "I didn't expect to see you here," Elise finally said, her voice steady but soft. Adrian nodded. "I didn't either." They sat in silence for a few moments, just taking in each other's presence. There were no immediate apologies or explanations, no grand declarations. Just two people who had once been deeply intertwined, now meeting again on equal ground, as two individuals who had grown in different ways. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Adrian said quietly, his gaze fixed on the ground. "And I know there's no way to go back. But I've learned a lot since we parted ways. About myself, about life, about what really matters." Elise looked at him, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her lips. "I know. I've learned a lot too." For the first time in a long while, Adrian felt a sense of peace. He had come to terms with their past, and he understood that some things were simply meant to be left behind. "I'm glad you found your way," Adrian said sincerely. Elise nodded, her eyes warm with gratitude. "I'm glad you have too." And with that, they sat together in the quiet park, no longer burdened by the weight of what had been. Instead, they shared a moment of understanding, one that spoke volumes without the need for words. Adrian's days continued to pass in a quiet rhythm, but the internal changes within him were anything but subtle. At the shelter, his role had grown beyond that of an assistant. He was now mentoring younger men who had found themselves in difficult situations, people who had come from backgrounds similar to his own, people who had been broken by life's harsh realities. It was a role that he had never anticipated, but it was one he embraced with an open heart. The work was exhausting, both emotionally and physically. He spent long hours helping them build resumes, prepare for interviews, and most importantly, address the deeper emotional scars that held them back. Through these interactions, Adrian had learned that true healing didn't come from external validation or material success. It came from recognizing your worth, from learning to forgive yourself, and from understanding that your past doesn't define you. In many ways, mentoring these men helped Adrian continue his own healing process. The more he helped them, the more he understood his own struggles. He saw pieces of himself in their pain, the same desperation for validation, the same need to prove themselves to the world. Yet, as he watched them work through their difficulties, Adrian began to see something that had eluded him for so long: the power of vulnerability. There were nights when Adrian would return to his small apartment, exhausted but fulfilled. He would sit at his kitchen table, staring at the wall, reflecting on the conversations he'd had during the day. Sometimes, the men he mentored would share their stories with him, stories of addiction, loss and heartbreak. They spoke of their mistakes, and yet there was no shame in their voices. It was in these moments that Adrian realized the importance of living authentically, without hiding behind masks of pride or perfection. In one particular session, a young man named Marcus had broken down in front of him. Marcus had been struggling with his addiction, unable to break free from the cycle of self-doubt and despair that had controlled his life for years. He confessed to Adrian that he felt like he would never be enough, that his past mistakes would always define him. "I don't know how to stop feeling like I'm not worth saving," Marcus had said, tears streaming down his face. "Like I'm just a failure. Like I'll never be good enough." Adrian sat with him in silence, unsure of how to respond at first. He didn't have all the answers, but he did understand the weight of Marcus's words. He had felt that way for so long, convinced that his past mistakes had rendered him unworthy of love or redemption. But then he remembered the lessons he had learned through therapy, the realization that mistakes didn't define a person, and that growth was not only possible but necessary. "You are worthy of forgiveness," Adrian said softly, placing a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "It starts with forgiving yourself. I've been where you are, and I'm telling you, it gets better. You just have to keep going, keep working, keep believing that change is possible." The words felt true as they left his mouth, and for the first time, Adrian felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This was where he was meant to be, not in the world of business or wealth, but here, helping others heal, guiding them through the same darkness he had once walked through himself. It was in this moment, sitting with Marcus, that Adrian understood his own capacity for growth. He could forgive himself, he could change, and he was doing it every day, through his actions, through his commitment to helping others, and through his willingness to be vulnerable. Elisa's journey, too, continued to unfold in ways that were both challenging and deeply rewarding. Her art had been a constant source of comfort, but it was her inner growth that had truly surprised her. In the months following her exhibition in Milan, she had felt a sense of freedom that was both exhilarating and terrifying. She had left behind the constraints of her former life, the expectations that had once been placed on her. But there were days when the weight of that newfound freedom felt overwhelming. There were mornings when Elise would wake up, her mind racing with the questions of who she was now. Without Adrian, without the role she had once played in their relationship. Who was she? Had she truly built a life that was entirely her own? Or was she simply running away from the pain of the past? It was on one such morning, as she stood in front of her easel, staring at a blank canvas, that the answer came to her. Elise had spent so much of her life trying to be someone she wasn't, trying to be the perfect partner, the perfect woman. But now, she realized that true liberation came from being unapologetically herself. She no longer needed to seek validation from others, especially not from Adrian. She didn't need to be anyone other than the woman she was becoming. Her paintings began to reflect this new truth. Her brushstrokes grew bolder, her colors more vibrant, as if her soul was speaking through the canvas. She started to experiment with different mediums, mixing oil paints with pastels, adding texture and layers to her work. It was as if the act of creation had become a physical manifestation of her own evolution. She was no longer hiding from the world. She was embracing it fully, in all its beauty and imperfection. One day, as she was working in her studio, Elise received a message from an art dealer in New York City, who had seen some of her recent work online. He expressed interest in representing her and arranging an exhibition in the city. It was an opportunity she had dreamed of for years. But as she read the message, she felt a strange sense of ambivalence. The thought of showcasing her work in New York was thrilling, but it also felt like a test. Would she go back to the woman she had been before, chasing after external validation and success? Or would she continue to create art that was true to herself, regardless of the external rewards? Elise spent the next few days reflecting on the decision. She spoke with her closest friends, who encouraged her to take the opportunity. But in her heart, Elise knew that it wasn't about the gallery or the recognition. It was about what she wanted to express. It was about finding the courage to continue her journey without the need for external approval. And so, she accepted the offer, but with one condition. The exhibition would showcase not only her work, but also the process behind it. Elise wanted people to understand that her art was not just a product of skill, but a product of growth. She wanted to show the world the vulnerability and strength that had gone into each piece. The struggles, the triumphs, the tears, and the laughter. As Elise prepared for her exhibition in New York, Adrian continued his work at the shelter, helping others rebuild their lives. Both of them were immersed in their respective worlds, but the memories of their shared past still lingered in the background, like a soft echo that occasionally rose to the surface. They had both changed, and yet there were moments when they wondered about the other, how the other was faring, if they were truly at peace with what had happened. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when their lives intersected once again. Adrian had been invited to a fundraiser for the shelter, a gathering of donors and volunteers who supported the organization's mission. As he entered the venue, he was immediately struck by the energy of the room. People were laughing, talking, and enjoying the evening. Adrian had never been one for social events, but tonight, something felt different. He was no longer the man who sought attention or approval. He was just Adrian, a man who had embraced his own growth and transformation. And then, as he moved through the crowd, he saw her. Elise was standing by the refreshment table, her vibrant red dress catching the light. She looked even more beautiful than he remembered. But it wasn't just her appearance that struck him. It was the sense of calm and assurance that radiated from her. She was standing tall, her posture open and inviting, and there was a quiet confidence in her eyes that Adrian had never seen before. For a moment, neither of them spoke. There was an undeniable tension in the air, but it wasn't the kind of tension that comes from unresolved anger or bitterness. It was the kind of tension that comes from two people who have experienced deep personal growth and who now understand me. Importance of respect and understanding. Elise, Adrian said softly, breaking the silence. Adrian, she replied with a smile. Her voice was warm, that there was a layer of distance between them, a distance that had been created by time and growth. They stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say next. Neither of them was interested in reliving the past. They were both too focused on the present to dwell on old wounds. Instead, they simply shared a quiet moment of recognition, as if acknowledging the journeys they had each been on. "I heard about your exhibition in New York," Adrian said, his voice filled with genuine admiration. "That's incredible, Elise. I'm really proud of you." "Thank you," she replied, her smile widening. "It's been a long road, but I'm finally getting there." There was a moment of silence between them before Elise spoke again. "And you? How are you?" Adrian's answer was simple but honest. "I'm good. Really good. It's been a journey, but I'm finally at peace with who I am." The conversation didn't need to go any deeper. They had both said what needed to be said. They were no longer the people they had been when they were together. They were two individuals, living their own lives, embracing their own growth. And as they parted that evening, there was no sense of unfinished business between them. There was only mutual respect and the quiet, understanding that both of them had come to a place of peace. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, neither Adrian nor Elise felt the need to look back. Adrian's life had been one of constant motion. It was as if he had always been running, racing towards something, whether it was success, wealth, or the approval of others. But now, as he spent more time at the shelter, working closely with the men who came there, he found that his need for external validation was slowly fading away. It was as though, by helping them heal, he was healing himself. Each conversation with the men at the shelter was a lesson in humility. He had spent so much of his life focused on climbing ladders, pushing others out of his way to reach the top. But now, sitting across from these men, hearing their struggles and witnessing their courage, Adrian began to see things differently. Success wasn't about standing above others. It was about lifting others up, helping them see their own worth. It was on one particularly difficult afternoon that Adrian's new sense of purpose truly came into focus. He was meeting with a young man named James, who had been in and out of the shelter for years, struggling with addiction and poverty. James had a fire in him, but it was buried beneath layers of self-doubt and resentment. The walls he had built around himself were thick, and he had a tendency to shut people out, especially those who tried to offer him help. "Why do you even bother?" James had asked Adrian that day, his tone laced with bitterness. "You don't understand what it's like to be me. You've never had to fight just to survive." Adrian had paused, feeling a pang of empathy. The old version of him, the man who had once believed that success could only be earned through sheer strength and control, might have responded defensively. He might have tried to assert his own struggles as a way to match James's pain. But now, Adrian simply listened. He didn't try to convince James that he understood. Instead, he sat in the discomfort of the silence, allowing James to feel heard. After a long pause, Adrian spoke, his voice steady but filled with compassion. "You're right. I don't know exactly what it's like to be you, but I do know what it's like to feel like you're not enough. I've been there, and I want you to know that no matter what, you're worth fighting for. You deserve more than this life." The words felt heavy in the air, and for a long time, James didn't respond. But Adrian could see a shift happening in him. The walls that had surrounded him for so long were beginning to crack. It wasn't a dramatic breakthrough, but it was a start. And that was enough. Adrian realized then that the work he was doing wasn't just about helping others. It was about helping himself. Each time he offered support to someone else, he was also offering it to himself. He was confronting the same fears, the same feelings of inadequacy that had held him back for years. He was learning that it was okay to not have all the answers. It was okay to show up, to be present, and to admit that sometimes all you could offer was your genuine, unfiltered self. That evening, after the session with James, Adrian returned home feeling a profound sense of peace. He had always been so focused on the future, always trying to control every aspect of his life. But now, he was learning to live in the present moment. For the first time, he wasn't running from his past or his fears. He was embracing them. And in doing so, he was starting to understand the true meaning of self-acceptance. As the days turned into weeks, Adrian began to see the ripple effect of his work. The men he mentored were beginning to change, not because of him, but because they were starting to see their own potential. Adrian realized that true leadership wasn't about fixing people. It was about empowering them to find their own strength. And that, more than anything, was what brought him fulfillment. Elisa's journey of self-discovery had taken her into unexpected places. Her art, once a reflection of her inner turmoil and unresolved emotions, was now a manifestation of her growth. She had spent years hiding behind her paintings, using them as a shield to protect herself from the world. But now, her work had evolved into something more profound. It was no longer just about her. It was about the shared human experience, the pain, the joy, the hope, and the vulnerability that connected everyone. As she prepared for her exhibition in New York, Elise found herself reflecting on the path that had led her here. She remembered the early days of her relationship with Adrian, the days when she had poured all her energy into him, hoping that their love would fill the empty spaces in her heart. She had been so focused on finding validation through her relationship that she had neglected the one relationship that truly mattered, the relationship with herself. But now, as she stood in her studio, staring at the pieces she was about to present to the world, she felt a deep sense of pride. Each piece was an expression of her truth, an acknowledgement of her journey, and a declaration of her independence. The vulnerability that had once held her back now fueled her creativity. She was no longer afraid to show the world the raw, unfiltered version of herself. It was during this period of reflection that Elise discovered a new level of artistic freedom. She began to experiment with different styles and mediums, pushing the boundaries of what she had previously considered her limits. She painted with her fingers instead of brushes, allowing the texture and emotion of her movements to guide the direction of the piece. She blended colors in ways that were unconventional, mixing oil paints with charcoal and pastels. The result was a series of powerful, evocative works that spoke of both the light and the darkness within her. Each painting seemed to embody a moment in her life, a memory, a feeling, a moment of clarity or uncertainty. One of her pieces, titled Asterisk Fragments of Light, depicted a woman standing in a field, her body broken into shards of light and shadow. It was a metaphor for the fractured nature of her own experience, how she had often felt torn between who she had been and who she was becoming. But there was also hope in the painting. The light seemed to emanate from the woman, shining through the cracks in her form, symbolizing the resilience that had emerged from her pain. As the exhibition approached, Elise found herself filled with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This was the moment she had dreamed of, but it also felt like a test. Would the world accept her work? Would they understand the deeper layers of meaning she had poured into each piece? More importantly, would she accept herself, regardless of the outcome? It was on the night of her exhibition in New York that Elise found herself facing the most unexpected reunion. The gallery was bustling with people critics, buyers and fellow artists, each admiring her work, discussing its meaning and debating its significance. Elise had spent the last few hours mingling, that she felt a growing sense of restlessness. She had come so far in her journey, that there was still a part of her that longed for closure. And then, as she moved through the crowd, she saw him. Adrian stood near one of her paintings, his gaze fixed on the piece titled *Fragments of Light. She hadn't expected him to be here, but there he was, standing quietly in the corner of the room, as if drawn by an invisible force. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Adrian was different. There was a softness to him now, a humility that had been absent during their earlier years together. It was as though he had shed the layers of defensiveness and pride that had once defined him. In his eyes, Elise could see the growth he had undergone, the deep, transformative work he had done on himself. She made her way over to him, her heart pounding in her chest. When she reached him, there was no need for words. They stood in front of the painting in silence, both taking in its beauty and complexity. "I've been following your work from afar," Adrian said, his voice sincere. "It's incredible, Elise. I never realized how much you were holding inside. Your art, it's powerful." Elise smiled softly, her eyes brimming with emotion. "Thank you. It's been a long road to get here." The words felt like a bridge between them, connecting the past with the present. They had both come so far, each of them had walked through their own version of darkness and emerged stronger for it. And now, standing in front of her art, they were no longer the people they had once been. "I'm proud of you," Adrian said, his voice filled with quiet admiration. Elise felt a rush of warmth in her chest. "I'm proud of you too, Adrian. You've changed, and that's a beautiful thing." In that moment, there was no need for explanations or apologies. They both understood that the past had shaped them, but it didn't define them. They had both come to realize that healing wasn't a destination. It was a journey that would continue for as long as they lived. And as they stood there, surrounded by her art and the people who admired it, they knew that they had finally found a place of peace, both with themselves and with each other. This continuation of Adrian and Elise's journey explores deeper aspects of their personal growth, highlighting their transformations, their individual paths to healing, and their eventual reconnection. Their shared history still lingers in the background, but both have learned to let go of the past and embrace the present. Let me know if you would like to explore their story further, or delve into specific themes or moments of their journey. As Adrian continued his work at the shelter, something began to shift within him. Every day, he encountered stories of men and women who had been broken by the world, by addiction, by loss, by rejection. Yet, each of these individuals had a fire within them, a spark that had been dimmed but never entirely extinguished. Adrian's role was to help them rediscover that spark, to guide them toward a place of healing. But in doing so, he realized he was also healing himself. It was during a particularly challenging session with a young man named David that Adrian had a revelation. David had been struggling with his sense of identity. Raised in a broken home, he had spent most of his life feeling worthless, believing that his mistakes and failures were a permanent part of who he was. Adrian had heard similar stories many times before, but something about David's pain struck a chord deep within him. David had spent years in and out of prison, and now, after a brief stint in jail, he had found his way to the shelter, hoping to turn his life around. But his self-doubt was crippling. "I don't even know who I am anymore," David said, his voice shaking. "I've messed up so many times. I'll never be anything other than a screw-up." Adrian sat across from him, the weight of David's words pressing against his chest. He had been there before. He had felt like he was defined by his past mistakes, that he could never be more than the person he had been. But now, after all the work he had done on himself, Adrian knew better. "I know it feels that way," Adrian said softly, his voice steady. "But you're not your mistakes. You're not the sum of your failures. You are so much more than that. You have the power to change. It won't be easy, but it starts with believing that you deserve better." David looked at him, his eyes filled with skepticism, but there was a flicker of something else, a glimmer of hope, perhaps, or a willingness to believe. It wasn't the kind of dramatic breakthrough that would instantly change David's life, but it was a seed planted in his heart. It was the beginning of a long journey, not just for David, but for Adrian as well. Adrian had always thought of himself as someone who was fixed, someone who had worked through his own issues and emerged stronger. But as he watched David struggle, Adrian began to realize that healing wasn't a one-time event. It was a lifelong process. No one was ever fully healed, and no one was beyond redemption. It was a continuous process of growth and learning. He didn't need to have all the answers or a perfect past. What mattered was that he was showing up, day after day, willing to help others even as he helped himself. Elise had always viewed art as a personal refuge, a space where she could express the emotions that words could not capture. But after her exhibition in New York, she found herself in a new phase of artistic discovery, one that was less about personal expression and more about universal connection. It was as though her art had taken on a life of its own, reaching beyond her individual experience and speaking to something deeper within the human soul. Her success in New York had opened doors. Galleries in other cities had reached out, offering to showcase her work, and collectors were eager to add her pieces to their collections. Yet, with every new offer and invitation, Elise felt a tug of discomfort. She had worked so hard to create art that was authentic to her experience, but now she was faced with the possibility that her work would be reduced to a commodity, something to be bought and sold. Elise spent long hours in her studio, wrestling with these conflicting emotions. On one hand, she wanted to share her art with the world, to have it appreciated and understood. But on the other hand, she feared that her work would be consumed by the commercial world, stripped of its meaning and reduced to something shallow. It was a battle between her desire for recognition and her need for authenticity. It was during this period of internal struggle that Elise decided to take a step back. She turned down several gallery offers and chose, instead, to focus on her own growth as an artist. She returned to the basics, painting without a clear purpose, allowing her emotions to guide her. She experimented with new techniques, using materials that she had never considered before. It was a return to the roots of her creativity, a reminder that art was not about pleasing others, but about expressing the truth of her own soul. One afternoon, as she worked on a new piece, an abstract painting that swirled with deep blues and fiery reds, she felt a profound sense of peace. She realized that the true purpose of her art was not to win approval or gain recognition, but to communicate something raw and authentic. It was about giving herself permission to be vulnerable, to expose the parts of herself that were still in the process of healing. She titled the piece, "The Unspoken," a representation of all the emotions she had been unable to articulate over the years. The chaotic brushstrokes mirrored the turmoil she had once felt inside, but the vibrant colors also represented the beauty that could emerge from that chaos. It was an act of reclaiming her power, not just as an artist, but as a woman who had learned to embrace her imperfections. Elise began to understand that success was not defined by external validation. It was defined by her willingness to stay true to her own vision, even when it was difficult or uncomfortable. She realized that her art was not something to be possessed or commodified. It was something to be shared, to be experienced. And in that sharing, she found freedom. It had been over a year since Adrian and Elise's paths had crossed in New York, but the impact of their brief reunion lingered in their minds. Both had changed so much in the time since. They were no longer the people they had been when they were together. But the connection between them, however, brief, had stirred something deep within them. It wasn't about rekindling their past relationship. It was about recognizing the mutual respect and admiration that had always existed between them, even when they had been unable to see it. It was on a crisp winter evening that Adrian found himself standing outside Elise's studio, staring at the warm glow of the windows. He had been meaning to visit her, to reconnect in a way that felt genuine and true to who they were now. He didn't want to rush into anything. He simply wanted to check in, to see how she was doing and to acknowledge the changes they had both undergone. Taking a deep breath, Adrian knocked softly on the door. After a few moments, Elise appeared, her face lighting up with surprise and warmth when she saw him. "Adrian," she said, her voice soft but filled with warmth. "What brings you here?" "I wanted to see how you were doing," Adrian replied, his tone sincere. "And I thought, maybe we could catch up. Just talk." Elise stepped aside to let him in, and the two of them settled in her studio, surrounded by the paintings that had come to define her artistic journey. The space was quiet, almost reverent, as though it were a sanctuary where the outside world could not touch them. They spoke for hours, catching up on the developments in their lives, the successes, the struggles, and everything in between. They spoke openly about the pain of their past, about their individual journeys of self-discovery, and about the lessons they had learned along the way. There was no pressure to fix anything, no expectation that they would return to what they once had. It was simply two people, sharing the fruits of their own growth. "I've been thinking about what you said to me that night in New York," Adrian said, his voice thoughtful, "about finding peace with myself. And I think I'm finally starting to understand what you meant. It's not about perfection. It's about being present, about showing up for myself, for others." Elise smiled, her heart swelling with pride for the man Adrian had become. "I'm glad you're starting to see that. It's a journey, isn't it? One we'll keep learning from." As the evening drew to a close, there was no sense of unfinished business between them. There was no longing for the past, no hope of rekindling a lost love. What existed now was something deeper, something rooted in mutual respect. understanding, and the recognition that both of them had become the people they were always meant to be. They didn't need to make any promises. Their paths had diverged, but in that moment they were content. The connection between them was still there, stronger and more meaningful than before. It was the kind of bond that didn't need to be defined by labels or expectations. It was simply a testament to the power of growth, healing, and self-acceptance. As the evening faded into the quiet of the night, Adrian and Elise sat together in a comfortable silence, each reflecting on the paths they had taken. The distance between them had been vast at times, yet the growth they had each experienced allowed them to see one another in ways they never had before. No longer bound by the past, they had each found peace in their own way. Adrian had learned that true success wasn't in achieving material wealth or external validation, but in helping others rise, in sharing vulnerability, and in accepting himself as he was, not as he once was, or as he had hoped to be. Elise had discovered that her art wasn't just a reflection of her inner world. It was a medium through which she could express both the beauty and the pain of the human experience, with no need for approval or recognition. She had learned that authenticity, not perfection, was the key to true creativity and fulfillment. Their reunion wasn't the beginning of a romantic reconciliation, nor was it a closure to a chapter long closed. It was a moment of mutual recognition, an acknowledgement of the growth they had achieved individually, and an understanding that the lessons they had learned would always be part of them. They had surrendered to their own temptations, whether of the ego, the need for control, or the illusions of perfection, and emerged stronger for it. The moral of their story is simple, yet profound. ***, true growth comes not from running away from temptation or hardship, but from surrendering to the lessons they bring. It is through embracing vulnerability, accepting our imperfections, and allowing ourselves to heal that we find our true strength. The path to peace lies not in the pursuit of external validation, but in the quiet courage to show up as our authentic selves, to learn from our mistakes, and to help others do the same. ***. In the end, the greatest lesson was that peace isn't something to be achieved. It is something that emerges when we stop resisting life as it comes. ***. Only when we surrender to the ebb and flow of life, with all its challenges and beauty, can we truly find freedom. And so, both Adrian and Elise, each in their own way, found the courage to live authentically, to heal and to grow. They had learned to embrace the impermanence of life, to cherish the moments of connection, and to trust that, no matter how far apart their journeys had taken them, they were always moving toward the same destination: a life lived in peace, purpose, and self-acceptance. The story ends here, with both of them ready to face whatever the future holds, knowing that they are enough, and that peace is something they carry within themselves, no matter where they go.